What's up everybody, how's it going? Last week, I posted a video where I shared 3 tips on how you can write cleaner code as a software engineer. A lot of you seemed to really like that video. You wanted me to do a part 2, maybe even a part 3, but so this is the part 2. I'm going to be sharing 3 more tips on how you can write cleaner code. Now granted, this is not a sequential part 2. In other words, you don't have to watch the 2 parts in order, but if you haven't seen the first video, do watch it after this one. I'll put the link to it in the description and the comments down below. And now, let's jump into these 3 tips after I do one quick thing, and that is I'm going to eat this Oreo McFlurry from McDonald's. Oh my god, look at this. So good. Now this is the content that you subscribed for. So good. Almost as good as when you write clean code. Alright, I finished the McFlurry. Let's actually jump into these tips. So tip number 1 is a tip that you can apply in a production code base. You can apply it in coding interviews. It lends itself really well to coding interviews because, as you'll see, you encounter this type of stuff in coding interviews a lot. By the way, if you're preparing for your coding interviews or your systems design interviews, do check out my company, AlgoExpert. Go to algoexpert.io and use the promo code CLEM, CLEM, for a discount on the platform. But so this tip has to do with indentation and loops, conditional statements, any type of paradigm in coding that involves indentation. So let me show you an example. Let me show you what I mean. Here I've got some Python code for some sort of matrix traversal logic. I don't know exactly what it is. I just wrote kind of pseudocode, but you can see we've got a matrix, we've got a visited matrix, and we do some sort of traversal through the matrix, right? We iterate row by row, column by column, and here we've got a conditional statement that says if we're not visited at the row and column, if we haven't visited this row and column, then we're going to do some stuff. And inside this if statement, if the value at that row and column is not equal to 0, then we do even more stuff. And I've written a bunch of comments like some logic. And then here we've got an else statement. It looks like this else statement is if the value is 0, we increment some count of zeros. So the point is, there's a lot going on in this code. This isn't particularly bad code, but you might notice that we are indented like 4 times or 5 times, right? We've got the function indentation, the 2 for loops, an if statement, another if statement. And so what we can do to make this code just a little bit cleaner, a little bit more readable, is for big if statements or big blocks that are indented that don't have a corresponding else statement or that have a very small else statement, we can basically invert them such that we do not need the indentation. So let me show you here. Instead of doing if not visited and then the entire block of code, we can just do if visited, right? If we visited this row and column, then we simply continue and we don't do anything. Otherwise, and now we can just grab all of this and indent it back in. And here this reads even better than before because it's basically, okay, we traverse row by row, column by column. If we visited the value, we just skip it, we continue. Otherwise, anything that comes below it, we do. And then, by the same logic, we can do here with this if statement that's got a bunch of indented logic, and then a very small else statement. We can say, if the value is equal to 0, then we grab this count of zeros and we increment it here, and then we continue. So same thing as above. And then otherwise, we can just grab all of this and indent it in. And now we no longer need this else. And once again, like you can tell that we've saved so much inner indentation. It's now much easier to get what's going on because we don't have to figure out like which else or which if statement does this else correspond to. it just reads a little bit cleaner. And I'll show you a simpler example where this applies just as much. So I've got this function here, sum function, now we're writing in TypeScript, takes in an array of numbers, we iterate through the array, and if we are past the first index, so the index is not equal to 0, we do a bunch of logic. Here, it's kind of the same thing. Instead of having all this logic in this if statement, right, where we have to parse, okay, so we only do this if the index is greater than 0, we can just say, if I is equal to 0, continue. Otherwise, now we can delete this. We no longer need this entire if statement. Otherwise, we perform the logic. Now, I do want to emphasize here that... That's my cat. Okay, where was I? I do want to emphasize here that what I'm giving you here as tip number 1 is not some carved in stone rule. It doesn't mean that if you do indent, that your code is going to be garbage, it's going to be absolute trashware and super unclean code. No, but I do think that if you can remove these indentations, it will go a long way, it will make your code cleaner. This is especially visible, I think, in a more complex piece of code like this one, where there's a lot of indented stuff. And here, this just reads a little bit easier. It's easier to follow. And even in these smaller examples, it does read really nicely to just be able to continue or skip something, you know, like when the condition matches, and then otherwise, you just have your logic unindented right below. So that was tip number 1. Now let's move on to tip number 2. Tip number 2 is a little bit more nuanced because it actually has like a few different levels and there are different ways to approach it. But basically, tip number 2 is consistency. Consistency, consistency, consistency. Consistency is so important when it comes to writing clean code. Consistency in your variable names and the way that you name variables, the way that you name files, the way that you name functions. Consistency in the types of methods and libraries and packages that you use, and I'll show you an example in a second. Consistency in the way that you structure your files in your projects. Consistency everywhere. And like I said, there are different levels of consistency. I guess we should just jump in some examples so that you can see what I mean by this. So here, we're now writing in TSX, so let's say a React code base, and you should be able to follow along. This applies to any part of the stack. You don't have to be a front-end developer, but here I'm just showing you a front-end example. You see that I've got a simple function called render buttons, and for those of you who are paying close attention, you've probably already seen the inconsistency, the inconceivable inconsistency in the variable names in this function. We've got a cancel button, where the word button is fully written out, and then we've got a report button, where the word button is abbreviated, BTN. Now, on their own, having the full word button or the abbreviated button are fine, they're both fine, but together, no, like absolutely not. Like the way that this is, it's as if, imagine in English, you know the expression, it is what it is? It is what it is. This example here with cancel button and cancel button abbreviated, it's as if I had written this English sentence, it is what it's. Like, no. You want to be consistent in your variable naming, especially within the same function. And this is where we get to the levels of consistency. So you really want to be consistent within the same function, for example. If you're not, your code will really look like it's not clean. It'll look very sloppy. Then, even within the same file, ideally, you want to be consistent. Even in large files, you ideally want to have some consistency. But if you have, one function at the top of the file that uses button BTN, if we're talking about variable names, and one at the very bottom that uses the full word button, that might be a little bit more acceptable than in the same function. And then, obviously, you also want consistency across your entire code base. That's the ideal that you're striving for. But of course, it's natural to assume that if you're working in a huge code base and if people are making changes to that code base, there might be inconsistencies. But ideally, you strive to eliminate them and to make everything consistent. Now, like I said before, consistency doesn't necessarily just mean variable names. Variable names are a very common one. I've also seen things like, IDX for index. That's a fine name for an index. But if you call an index IDX, don't call it just I or index, the full word index, lower in the code. Or don't do something like, const index or let index equals 0, and then let left equals 0, where left is a left index. Ideally, you want to have them match. And again, this happens to anybody. Like, I think I may have written code like this in the past where I wouldn't have consistency in the naming, but ideally you want that consistency. Otherwise, I'm telling you, your code will look sloppier and it will just not be as clean. If we're really talking about clean code, this, I think, definitely makes your code cleaner or less clean. So let me show you another example unrelated to variable naming. Here I've got a file where I've got some asynchronous functions in JavaScript. So at the top, I've declared two functions that are both asynchronous. They don't do anything here, but you can imagine that these legitimately make a call to an API. So here you fetch some stuff from the API, and here you fetch some other stuff. So just imagine you are making legit API calls here. And then we've got some wrapper functions, very aptly named fetch stuff and fetch other stuff, that effectively just call these two asynchronous functions here. But you'll notice that I'm using two different JavaScript, paradigms or tools here. In one of them, I'm using this await keyword in JavaScript. If you're a front-end developer, if you write JavaScript, you probably know this, right? Async await. So this just means that nothing below this line 5 here will execute until this API call has resolved, until the asynchronicity of it has come back to us. I think you understand what I mean. Whereas in this function, instead of doing this await thing, I'm using the classic .then that you would use on an asynchronous function in JavaScript. So this basically would return like a promise, and then I would do .then, and then I get this stuff. Now, here, both of these are totally fine. And to this day, there are people who will use async await because it's a newer tool in JavaScript. And then there are others who will not use it. They'll stick to the classic .then, .catch that JavaScript exposes. But you want to pick one or the other. And if you're in the process of migrating your code base, let's say, to async await, which would be totally fair, ideally, within the same file, and especially within the same function or two functions back to back, you want to have that same thing. You want to have the consistency. So if you are refactoring your code base to use async await, then change every instance of .then in a particular file, or even in your entire code base, to async await. Consistency, consistency. And the last example that I wanted to show you just has to do with file structure. So here, imagine that we've got a lib directory, libraries directory, and we've got different subdirectories for various parts of our application. So let's say we're designing YouTube. You've got videos as a directory, you've got comments as a directory, and you'll notice that here, under comments, we've got 3 different files. An API file, it's empty, I didn't write anything, but you could imagine that this is where you have your actual functions that interact with your API servers. Then we've got a consts file, so probably here we would have constants, things that we use that are constants in the front-end code base relevant to comments. And then we've got a helpers file, which would presumably be helper functions related to comments that do not interact with the API. That's fine. That is a type of file structure that you could have. But then you'll notice that for the videos one, first of all, we don't have the helpers file. So maybe the person who wrote this puts their helpers in the API file. And here suddenly you've got this inconsistency. It's like, why are the videos, why is this subdirectory different than this one? If someone is new to the code base, they might be a little bit confused. And then this constants file, we named it constants instead of consts. So again, it's not a huge deal, right? Some people might even be like, okay, you're over-exaggerating. This is so nitpicky. But when this type of stuff adds up, this type of inconsistency, it leads to really, really bad experiences and just to this feeling of, this is sloppy. This is unclean, this is dirty, we have to cleanse it, we have to clean it up. Consistency. Consistency. All right, so that was tip number 2. Now let's move on to the third and final tip, tip number 3. This one is one of my favorites, and it has to do with documenting your code. Now wait, it's not as simple as just document your code and add comments. If anything, I'm actually a large proponent of trying to avoid writing comments or documenting your code as much as possible. What I mean by that is you ideally want to write your code in such a way that it is self-explanatory, that it does not need documentation. And if you remember from the first video with the 3 tips that I gave about clean code last week, if you haven't watched it, well, go watch it. The second tip that I gave had to do with capturing pieces of logic, like confusing pieces of logic, in very descriptively named variables. Things that when you read them, you immediately understand what's going on, even if the logic was otherwise confusing. And that is great. And if you do that very consistently, you will write code that barely needs to be documented. However, there will be cases, you will encounter these cases, where there still is a part of your code that does not make sense to the average user, or rather, to the person who does not have context, to the person who doesn't know exactly why this was done. So for example, let me show you 3 examples here, really interesting ones, and the first one happens to be related to the front end, but again, you could extend this to any part of the stack. It's not limited to just front end. But here, we've got this function called setTextAndColor, and it takes in an HTML element, a text, and color. So you can imagine that we've got an element, in the DOM that we are going to put text in, and we are going to set its color. Now, if you look at the code, there are 2 lines that make sense. Element.innerText equals text. Okay, we're setting the text. Element.style.color equals color. Okay, we're setting the color. But why in the world are we wrapping these 2 lines of code with element.style.display equals none, which basically means that the element will not show up on the screen, and then we are removing that. We are resetting the display to the empty string. Why did we just do that? If you were someone who were jumping into this code base and you'd never worked in this code base before and you saw this, you would very likely be like, I have no idea who the fuck wrote this code, why they did that, whether they were drunk or not when they wrote that, what is going on here, right? And so what you want to do is you want to document code that is otherwise not self-explanatory. And so here, what you want to do is you want to write a comment that is going to explain why it is that you are doing this weird thing of setting the display to none and then resetting it. And by the way, this particular example, this thing with the display, is something that I have actually seen in an open source GitHub repository. So here you would want to explain why you're doing that. You would maybe say we have to set the display to none to minimize the number of renders that happen when we set the text and color. Now, when someone comes here, they will read this comment, they will understand why you're doing this, and this is a comment where there really wouldn't have been a better way to explain this than through a comment. You would not have been able to capture this in some variable. You wouldn't have been able to do something like, oh, const, we have to do this equals element.style. It doesn't make sense, right? So this is one of those cases where a comment really does go a long way. And I'll show you a couple of other examples. So the second example that I've got 5 or 4 functions here. I didn't do anything in them, but I just declared them. So foo, bar, baz, and reset styles. And then we've got one function, initialize component. This would also be in a front-end code base, but it doesn't matter. This could be anywhere. And this function calls foo, bar, and baz. Then it calls reset styles. And then it does a set timeout, which if you are familiar with JavaScript, what this does is it says, execute what is inside of this, meaning another call to reset styles, in 1 millisecond. So I put 1 millisecond here, not 1,000 milliseconds, which would be 1 second, not 10,000 milliseconds, 1 millisecond. This doesn't make sense. If someone's reading this, they would be like, why? there's probably a reason, but why is this happening? And so again, like you can't really capture this in a descriptive variable name. That doesn't make sense. So you want to make sure that you add a comment that explains this. And here again, this is something that I think we had in Algo Expert. It escapes me now why we had this, but you want to explain, why are we recalling this function with a 1 millisecond delay? Is it some kind of weird like front-end bug or hack or something? Add the comment. The people who maintain this code base in the future, including yourself, will thank you. And now one final example on this topic here, example 3. I've got these two functions, do something to an array, do something else to an array. Both of these take an array of numbers. And then I've got our main function, format array for API. Takes in a number, or an array of numbers rather, calls these two functions on it, okay? Then declares a variable called const stringified values. It maps every value in the array, which is a number, right? Every value is a number, to a string value. But then it slices the array starting at 1. In other words, it removes the first value in the array. And then it returns those stringified values. Like here, when you read this code, everything kind of reads like English, everything kind of makes sense, except for this slice of 1. Like, why are we removing the first value? And especially imagine like this had really like meaning. Imagine, stringified values was like, I don't know, videos on the trending page on YouTube. Why are we removing the first one, right? And this is where you would explain this in a comment. It would be like, we have to remove the first value because, I don't know, it's the number one on trending, and we deal with that separately. Right, separately. I'm just giving an example here. Like, this comment doesn't make any sense. Like, this is even like worse. But you get the idea. Like, if you have a reason for doing something like this, which is otherwise unclear, and it's not really simple to capture this in a variable or anything like that, then you document it. This is where comments really come into play. This is when they really become handy. But otherwise, if you can, try to not have comments. That's my philosophy. Minimize the number of comments that you need in your code base. Write your code in such a way that it is so clean that it does not require comments, but when it does require comments, you put those damn comments. That's going to be it for these 3 tips. I really hope that you enjoyed them. I hope that you found them useful. Let me know what you thought about them in the comments below. Do you want a part 3 to this series? Let me know. Otherwise, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Of course, smash the like button. Follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter if you enjoy short-form written content, especially LinkedIn. I am almost at 100,000 followers. I'd really appreciate it if you followed me there. Instagram if you like pictures, and otherwise I will see you in the next video.